Hey, what's up, guys? Walking the dog here, but we figured out what's going on with the Note 9 camera issue, and the same thing happened with the Note 8. So basically what's going on is the issue is that the phones are getting so fast internally that when they're writing the data to the card is not fast enough. It's not as fast as the phone actually is. So what's going to happen is the phone will actually lock up because it doesn't know what to do. It's not going to slow down. It's going to lock up. So it's got to be, if you got a class 3, class 2, it's not going to work. It's got to be a class 1 card, something newer. They're not cheap either. I have one that's 400 gig, and it's on sale actually right now, like 150 bucks, but it was like 500 not like a week ago. But so the SD card has to be a 4K compatible and a class 1, okay, or else the phone's going to lock up. We tested this out earlier today on a Note 8 and a Note 9, same thing. And so like we're doing now, we're uploading a video to YouTube right now, and I'm recording in 60 frames a second, 4K in the dark, walking the dog. So same thing with applications. Applications are the same way. A lot of the applications will write to the card automatically. So if the card is slow, then the phone's going to seem slow. So same thing with on Note 8 was the same issue. And another issue with the Note 8 was the RAM. When people had too many applications that are open in the background and they're taxing out the RAM, and the phone is trying to write to cards and using all the resources for software, the phone was trying to put the data to the SD card. It was locking up until we swapped over to a class 1. But the same thing on the Note 9. If you take a new SD card that's class 1, that's designed for 4K, 30 frames a second or 60 frames a second, you'll be okay. But for some reason though, even though you get that card, the Note 9 wants to write the 4K 60 frames a second to the internal of the phone. That's with the 512 gigabyte model and the 128 gigabyte model. Okay, so now if you have 4K at 30 frames a second, then the phone has no problems with that. What about 1080p, you ask, at 60 frames a second? Well, that's no problem. That writes to the card with no issues. Now, you can transfer the file from the phone, the 4K 60 frames a second, to the card. You can transfer that after the fact, and that's not a problem. But the card has to be designed specifically for 4K, and it's got to be a class 1. They're not cheap, okay? So it's basically, your car is a Ferrari, the phone is a Ferrari, and the phone is only going to be as fast as the slowest part, if you think about that. So the phone basically, has memory that's, absurd. It's like, DDR10 or something, and the speed is something like 10 gigs a second in the Note 9. So what's the speed that it needs to see here? I'm looking at my notes. So it says, we're saying here that from earlier, the card has to handle a minimum of 30 megabits a second or higher. That's minimum, rock bottom, or else it's not going to work right. So that's a 4K card. Some cards only do 4K 30 frames a second. Some cards will do 4K 60 frames a second. The more frames you got per second on a higher resolution like 4K, it's huge amounts of data that's got to be written to the card as you're recording. So, same thing with when you're editing software or pictures, the same thing. All the phone is doing is it's going to do two things. It's editing in the phone, and it's trying to write the results to the SD card. So if the software seems slow, your card is the wrong card for the phone. All right. So like I said, remember, class 1, it's got to be designed for 4K. And actually, Samsung is coming out with a card that's 512. It should be out in a week. 512 gigabyte. And that's compatible with this phone. There's a couple other cards, micro SD cards that are compatible. There's only like 3 cards out right now that are worthwhile. And I could probably put those in the link later on for you guys. But remember, if you're going shopping and you got a fast phone like this, the phone could be